On May 19th, 1915, Lance Corporal Albert Jacka of the 14th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force was in a trench on Turkey's Gallipoli Peninsula called Courtney's Post when it was attacked in a major offensive by troops of the Ottoman Empire. What came next would make him a legend in Australia. The story of the first Australian soldier to be awarded the Victoria Cross during the Great War deserves to be remembered. When Britain and Germany went to war on August 5, 1914, the Australian War Memorial explains, the outbreak of war was greeted in Australia, as in many other places, with great enthusiasm. Australia was in the middle of an election in an unsettled political period, but both Prime Minister Joseph Cook and his Labour opponent Andrew Fisher pledged their full support to Britain. A volunteer force, the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force, was quickly raised and sent to occupy former German possessions in the Pacific. But a much larger expeditionary force was also quickly authorized, the 1st Australian Expeditionary Force. According to Australian law, conscripts could not be sent overseas, so the new force would be an all-volunteer group. Among the first to volunteer was Albert Jacka. The Perth Western Mail described him as a young country lad employed by the State Forestry Department. 21 years old, the Mail described him as a man of middle height, strong features, and deliberate action. Australia was scrambling with a quick mobilization and lacked the facilities to train the initial 20,000 men of the AIF. A Whittlesea man, Robert Garrick Wilson, offered a part of his estate to the government of Victoria, which was transformed into Broadmeadows Military Camp, and Albert Jacka was one of 2,500 volunteers from Victoria to be sent to the camp. The Kalgoorlie miner noted that Jacka would have been more comfortable than most on the camp. Working with the forestry department had made him strong and wiry, and he'd become accustomed to sleeping in a tent. The brigade was commanded by John Monash, who would become one of the most important Australian officers of the war. In January, Jacka and the 14th were sent to Alexandria to defend the Suez Canal from Germany's ally, the Ottoman Empire. The 4th Brigade was combined with 2 New Zealand and 1 Light Horse Brigade to form the New Zealand and Australian Division. But they were being sent to another place that most have never heard of. The Australian War Memorial writes, after 4.5 months of training near Cairo, the Australians departed by ship for the Gallipoli Peninsula, along with troops from New Zealand, Britain, and France. On April 25, 1915, the Australians landed at what became known as Anzac Cove, whereupon they established a tenuous foothold on the steep slopes above the beach. The miner writes, before April 25, 1915, Gallipoli was not even a name to Australians generally. It was to become, owing to events extending over several months of that year, a place of hallowed and poignant memories. The goal of the campaign was to take command of the Turkish Straits, which allowed naval access into the Black Sea, thus opening the Turkish capital of Constantinople to naval bombardment. The landing was difficult. The ground was steep, giving the Turkish troops a commanding position. The troops of the New Zealand and Australia Division were able to capture only a small beachhead. The Western Mail writes, after those first few hectic days, all efforts were bent towards consolidating the position. How those men worked! Rugged hills were soon made as defensively strong as possible, and dugouts were constructed and occupied by its defenders, who needed shelter in that small area so that sleep could be had in the off-duty. By mid-May, they were defending a line only about a kilometer from the landing zone. Jack and his company were defending a line called Courtney's Post. Penelope Arden writes in her 2024 book, Albert Jacka, The Untold Story of Australia's Most Decorated World War I Soldier, that, named after Lieutenant Colonel Richard Courtney, who commanded the Australian forces in the sector, the post set atop a ridge line that overlooked the Turkish lines. The Western Mail writes that fighting, digging, carrying stores, caring for wounded men, and well-sinking were continuous. Arden writes that for the men who fought there, life was fraught with constant danger. She describes the trenches as narrow and shallow. The trenches were very near the Ottoman lines, only 100 yards apart in some places, subjecting them to frequent raids and bombardment. Jack had been promoted to Lance Corporal and had, Arden notes, already earned a reputation for his toughness and leadership. The Turks commenced a large counterattack on May 19th, involving thousands of troops. The Western Mail writes that after a fairly peaceful day on May 18th, the enemy opened up at 5 p.m. the heaviest bombardment yet experienced on Anzac. At midnight, there was a wild outburst of rifle fire from the Turks. Towards daylight, the Turks came to make good on their boast that they would push the Australians into the sea. One of their primary targets was the high ground of Courtney's Post. In his 12-volume official history of Australia in the war, 1914 to 1918, C.E.W. Bean describes Jacka's actions that day. On this slope, a considerable force managed to assemble, and about 4 o'clock a rush was made in mass. A section of the enemy's line, reaching the summit, suddenly hurled its bombs into a trench bay, killing 2 of the 9 or 10 men who held it, wounding 2 others, and filling the trench with smoke and dust. In the confusion, a number of the Turks leapt into the bay, the remaining Australians recoiling along the trench. A dozen yards of the firing line thus became filled with the enemy. Arden explains Jacka and his comrades faced an existential threat if the Turks secured a foothold in the trenches. They could roll up the Anzac defenses, leading to a catastrophic loss of territory. The 14th were keeping the Turks bottled up. As they tried to move south, they were held up by warning shots from members of the 14th in a communication trench. Trying to move north, they were held up by Jacka's warning shots in the wall of the trench opposite. But eventually the Turks would be able to storm his position. A company lieutenant was wounded and another killed. Another lieutenant named Crabb was sent to the line, and Jacka managed to warn him not to jump into the firing line. Bean writes, Crabb asked him whether, if given support, he would charge the Turks. He responded, yes, I want 2 or 3. 3 volunteers joined Jacka as he jumped from behind his traverse to the communication trench, and then led them in, bayonets fixed. The first shots missed Jacka, but the other 3 men were all wounded, and he was forced to retreat. Bean writes, the first attempt to oust the Turks having failed, Crabb arranged that a feint should be made from the same end while Jacka should leap in upon the Turks from behind. The diversion was made by throwing 2 bombs, hand grenades, but neither exploded in the bay with the Turks, both rolling too far. Still, Bean explains, they created smoke and noise, under the cover of which Jacka leapt over the parapet, shot 5 of the Turks, and bayoneted 2. The remainder scrambled out. On entering the position, which was piled with dead, Crabb found Jacka flushed with the excitement of the preceding hour. I managed to get the beggar, sir, he said. Private William Jones of the 14th later recalled, I've never seen anything like it. The Turks had us pinned down, and we thought that was it. Then Jacka, cool as you like, jumps up and starts taking them on. It was like something out of a story. We were all rooted to the spot, just watching him fight. He didn't stop until they were all gone, and I remember thinking, that's the bravest thing I've ever seen. Jacka had single-handedly cleared the trench and saved the position. It didn't go unnoticed. The Western Mail writes, suddenly the troops in the field, those at home in Australia, everyone was thrilled to learn that the Victoria Cross had been awarded to an Australian. The extract from the London Gazette on July 23rd, notifying the award, published in military orders in the newspapers, was read and reread. How well some men will recall its wording. For most conspicuous bravery on the night of the 19th-20th May, 1915, at Courtney's Post, Gallipoli Peninsula, Lance Corporal Jacka, while holding a portion of our trench with 4 other men, was heavily attacked, when all except himself were killed or wounded. The trench was rushed and occupied by 7 Turks. Lance Corporal Jacka at once most gallantly attacked them single-handed and killed the whole party, 5 by rifle fire and 2 with the bayonet. It was an important event for Australia. The Western Mail explains that not only throughout the Empire, but throughout the whole world, the Victoria Cross is recognized as a symbol of outstanding gallantry in the face of the enemy. Bean explains that after winning the VC, he became and remained an inspiration to the Australian troops in the war zone. Arden writes that it had far-reaching implications for the Australian military effort. At the time when the Gallipoli campaign was marked by high casualties and strategic uncertainty, Jacka's actions reminded the soldiers that individual acts of bravery could still turn the tide in their favor. The Australian War Memorial writes, Jacka quickly became famous. His likeness was used on recruiting posters, and his exploits featured regularly in newspapers, particularly in his native Victoria. As the campaign ground on, Arden writes, the men in his unit began to view him not only as a Victoria Cross recipient, but as a leader they could trust. Even as the war ground on and the Anzac forces faced mounting losses, Jacka's presence provided a sense of stability. The Western Mail writes that it is commonplace to hear a unit called after its commanding officer. But here there was a junior whose name was applied to his battalion. The 14th Battalion was called Jacka's Mob. Jacka received a series of promotions. The Western Mail writes, he had only 1 stripe when the VC was gained by him in May 1915, and it was not until August that he was made a corporal. The next month he became a sergeant, and in November a company sergeant major. In January 1916, the campaign in the Gallipoli Peninsula was finally abandoned, after both sides had suffered some 250,000 casualties. Once back in Egypt, Jacka was sent to officers' candidate school, and at the end of April he was commissioned, a 2nd lieutenant. Bean opined, Albert Jacka can be described as a frontline soldier, and one who at no time took the easy course. His decorations were well merited, and no one in his unit, for that matter the whole AIF, offered any criticism of his battle exploits or his receipt of the decorations, which were awarded to him. The 14th was then sent to the Western Front. There his heroics continued. The Australian Dictionary of Biography notes a particular action. The 14th Battalion was shipped to France in early June. Jacka's platoon moved into the line near Poitiers on the night of 6-7 August, and as dawn broke, German troops overran a part of the line. Jacka had just completed a reconnaissance and had gone to his dugout when 2 Germans appeared at its entrance and rolled a bomb down the doorway, killing 2 men. Jacka charged up the dugout steps, firing as he moved, and came upon a large number of enemy, rounding up some 40 Australians as prisoners. He rallied his platoon and charged at the enemy, some of whom immediately threw down their rifles. Furious hand-to-hand fighting erupted as the prisoners turned on their captors. 50 Germans were captured, and the line was retaken. Bean describes the action as the most dramatic and effective act of individual audacity in the history of the AIF. The Brisbane Queenslander explained, its results were of considerable tactical value, as it led to the complete destruction of a vigorously handled German attack on the Australian front. The ferocity of the attack showed on the depleted ranks of the AIF. The Queenslander writes, Jacka's platoon entered the engagement 52 strong and came out with 4 unwounded men. Jacka nearly lost his life, being wounded on no fewer than 7 occasions during the struggle, in which he killed nearly 30 Germans with his own hand. Jacka was awarded the Military Cross for the action. While he was recovering from his wounds, he was promoted to full lieutenant in August. He received his Victoria Cross from George V on September 29th. Then he was promoted to captain in March of 1917. The Australian War Memorial explains, Jacka, having risen no higher, has been attributed to his frequent disputes with superior officers. The Australian Dictionary Biography explains, he said what he meant and meant what he said, recalls one friend. While he was recovering from his wounds, another story illustrates how he was not always comfortable with the mantle of hero. A Captain Rule recalled, Bert, as you know, was never a ladies' man, and he very soon had as much attention as he could put up with. One day, some of us were sitting around his bed when a request to see him came from one of the London daily newspapers. Bert turned to one of the chaps. Go to the door and tell the beggar, I'm dead. The result was something we didn't bargain for. A big black headline, Death of Jacka, Australia's first VC winner, dies of his wounds. The accounts of his death being exaggerated, he returned to the front. On April 18th, the battalion was planning an advance, and Jacka had been leading a night team, marking where the Australians were supposed to advance through the wire. The Australian Dictionary of Biography writes, the work was virtually finished when 2 Germans loomed up. Realizing that they would see the tapes, Jacka knew that they must be captured. He pulled his pistol, but it misfired, so he rushed on and captured them by hand. Jacka's quick thinking had saved the Anzac units from discovery and probable disastrous bombardment. For this action, he was awarded a bar to his Military Cross, meaning the same decoration awarded a second time. In July, he was wounded by a sniper and hospitalized for nearly 2 months, but again returned to the line. Injury from a gas attack and chest wound in May of 1918 finally ended his career on the line. He was assigned to train new recruits and returned home in September 1919. The Australian Dictionary of Biography explains, a large crowd, including the Governor-General, greeted the ship when it berthed at Melbourne, and a convoy of 85 cars with Jacka at its head drove to the town hall, where men from the 14th Battalion welcomed their famous comrade. These were, of course, just a few of his exploits. He was recommended for other decorations in other actions. Bean opined that he had been shortchanged on his awards and had, in fact, earned 3 Victoria Crosses. He also received numerous other wounds, too many to describe here. He had always returned to his men. Corporal Frederick Moore of the 14th said of him, even as the bullets were flying and the grenades were going off, Jacka never lost his nerve. He seemed to know exactly what to do, as if it was instinct. When the rest of us were trying to hold on, he was thinking about how to win. I reckon that is what made the difference. After the war, Albert Jacka ran an import business and was elected the mayor of the Melbourne suburb of St Kilda. Passed away on January 17th, 1932, at just the age of 39 of chronic nephritis. The Dictionary of Australian Biography writes that Bert Jacka was described at his funeral as Australia's greatest frontline soldier. Few would challenge that assessment. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.